Today we have a unique opportunity to get every generation of the BMW M5 side by side and walk you through the history on this legendary car. The first generation BMW M5 started in 1984 and went all the way to 1988, and that's this E28 model. These were based on the 535i, but they used a modified engine from the BMW M1, that legendary supercar. That engine in question is this M88 3.5 liter inline six. This motor was enough to make this car the fastest production sedan in the world when it came out. And in other markets, it produced 282 horsepower, but here in North America, we got a detuned version with a catalytic converter, so it produced 256 horsepower. This M5 comes from an era of no-nonsense interiors, just nice materials, nice leather, a good old 5-speed manual transmission, analog gauges, and nothing else to get in the way of your experience of driving the car. Another one of the things that makes these original M5s so great is the fact that they only tip the scales at about 3,100 pounds, which for a four-door sedan is really not a lot. And that really lends to the way this car drives. And we had a very similar car to this at TFL and got to spend a lot of time with it. The other cool thing about these true M5s is that there were only a little over 2,200 of them produced, which makes this a super rare BMW M model. After the E28 M5 came the second generation E34 M5, and these went from 1988 to 1995, and they offered not only a sedan, but there were about 900 M5 wagons produced in this generation as well. Under the hood of this E34, well, it is, for one, a clamshell hood, which is always cool, but you'll find another 3.5 liter inline six. Now, there were some markets that got a 3.8 liter inline six, but North America, once again, was not one of those to get the cooler, more powerful version of the car. This 3.5 liter made about 311 horsepower, but the other markets that did get the later 3.8 liter got 335 horsepower. Now, the wheels on this M5 deserve a segment of their own because this is a crazy wheel design. These magnesium covers that are bolted onto the wheel here actually improve the cooling to the brakes by, BMW claimed, 25%. And over the years, they did update these wheels. These are the earlier style M system wheels, but they look cool and they function really well too. Inside of the E34 M5, the interior is definitely a lot more modern than it is in the E28, but it's still very analog and very no nonsense. You got a great looking set of gauges. You've got simple analog controls in here. And most of these cars had a 5-speed transmission, kind of like the earlier car, but in 1994 they did go to a 6-speed. These second generation M5s are a lot easier to get your hands on than the first generation cars because they made over 12,000 of these. However, they are a lot heavier than the first generation cars. They weigh in anywhere from 3,600 to 3,800 pounds depending on how you spec them out, which is a lot more than the E28. A lot of things changed in 1998 when the E39 M5 came out because no longer was the M5 built in a separate location by hand. Instead, this BMW M5 was built alongside the standard 5 Series. And they also, very importantly, moved away from one critical thing under the hood. This third generation M5 was the first to move away from the inline six. However, not to fret, because they moved to a 4.9 liter V8, and this was the engine that it had until it ceased production in 2003. And that's a good thing because these produce around 394 horsepower. Thankfully, not only did the V8 engine retain those individual throttle bodies that you had on the earlier inline sixes, but you also still have a manual transmission here, a 6-speed, and it's still a pretty analog interior. You do have a screen here in the dash, but for the most part, it's pretty simple. BMW did toss around the idea of making a wagon version of this generation M5, but it never really came to fruition. And I guess that's not necessarily a bad thing, because even this version of the M5 tipped the scales at almost 4,000 pounds, making it a pretty heavy sedan. From 2004 to 2010, this fourth generation BMW M5 came back in a big way, because it was not only this E60 sedan, but there was also the E61 wagon. Now, where the E39 brought things up to 8 cylinders, the E60 brought things to 10. This is a 5-liter, 500 horsepower V10. And of course, if you know about these cars, you know that these engines do not have a good reputation as far as reliability, but if you're a car guy, I'm sure you've also heard videos of these screaming down a tunnel with aftermarket pipes, and this has to be one of, if not the best sounding sedan in history. As if a screaming V10 wasn't cool enough, this E60 M5 also has 2 transmission options. You can get the 7-speed SMG, or if you're really cool, you'll get this 6-speed manual transmission. Once again, I mean, imagine a sedan with a V10 paired to a 6-speed manual transmission. It really doesn't get any cooler than that, reliability aside. And speaking of reliability, this also has the iDrive system, which was not BMW's most loved infotainment system, but this is really when these interiors did start to move into being much more modern. You've got a bigger screen, and so you're getting into more current car territory. The E60 M5 also tipped the scales at over 4,000 pounds, just over, and they produced quite a few of these cars, especially here for the US. It was a really big market for this generation of the M5. They did not do the wagon here. They sold about 20,000 of these cars total, but only about 1,000 of those were the wagon, and again, not in the US. After the E60, BMW built the F10 M5 from 2011 to 2016, and there were a whole host of changes, as with every other new M5 model, but one in particular caused a little bit of controversy. This generation of M5 marked the first time that the BMW M5 went down in its cylinder count. So we went from a V10 now back to a V8. However, this is also the first time that the M5 introduced turbocharging. So it's a twin turbo 4.4 liter V8 producing 553 horsepower. This generation BMW M5 had 2 transmission options. You could get a 7-speed dual clutch, or you could get, again, a 6-speed manual. This particular one does have the dual clutch, but the manual is still an option. And into this interior, it looks very modern. You've got a much more prominent screen than even the A60. It's a much easier system to use. It's a nicer, far more comfortable interior than any of the previous M5s. And you could also get these cars with a competition package that would up your horsepower to 567 horsepower, making it an incredibly high performance car as well. Later on in this car's life, that competition package upped its power output to 591 horsepower, which is great because these were again heavier than any previous generation of M5, between 4,300 and 4,400 pounds, making this definitely not a very lightweight car. Finally, we come to the most recent M5, which is this F90 generation, and these went from 2017 to 2023. Like the previous generation M5, this also runs a 4.4 liter twin turbo V8, and it's got actually the same power output as the later competition package cars of the previous generation. So 591 horsepower, but if you get a competition pack in this F90 generation M5, it's 617 horsepower. Now, the reason we're able to get all of these M5s together is because we're here at BMW's Performance Center, and that's why some of these newer M5s are kitted out with some racing equipment. And something important to note about this generation of M5 is that they did away with the manual transmission, so it's only an 8-speed automatic and actually not a dual clutch, because they found that this 8-speed automatic shifted plenty fast. And the other interesting thing about this generation of the M5 is that it's all-wheel drive. You can run it in a 2-wheel drive mode, but this was the first M5 to have all-wheel drive. And like with every other generation of M5, the interior in this car is much more modern than the one that comes before it. better screens, a really nice digital gauge cluster, and a great steering wheel with some programmable buttons. Unlike every other generation of M5, even though this car adopted all-wheel drive, it actually weighs slightly less than the M5 that came before it. And what's really impressive is if you get the CS version of this car, you've got 626 horsepower, so a few extra horsepower, and that's great. But that car weighs even less than the regular M5, around 4,100 pounds. So it's pretty cool that they did make these lighter. And that is a basic rundown on every generation of the BMW M5. Now, we did just get a chance to drive the new BMW 5 Series, and there's no word yet on an M5 for this new generation of the 5 Series. But here is the interesting question to ponder until maybe we see something like that coming out soon. The 5 Series has had no problem, no qualms with really reinventing the way that this car is, going to different powertrains, different transmissions, and from rear-wheel drive to all-wheel drive. So the question is, in this next generation M5, will we see some form of electrification? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. What's your favorite generation of M5? And we'll see you all in the next video.